and welcome to a Newsflash episode of Unpacking the Case, the podcast by Davitt Jones Bould, the real estate law specialists. As always, I'm joined by our head of legal training, Richard Snape. Hi, Richard.
Hello, Lizzie. And how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We've both had fresh haircuts, but unfortunately no one can see them.
Very nice.
I'm appreciating yours, you're appreciating mine.
Yes, can't see us on the podcast, though. There you are.
But we're here to talk about the Grenfell report, the final report that came out on the 4th of September, which has obviously been all over the news. But we've talked a lot about the Building Safety Act and related stuff over the last few months, or since Grenfell happened, in fact. So do you want to tell us a bit about the background to this report in particular?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Grenfell is June the 14th, 2017. Doesn't seem like it, but well over 7 years ago now. And the final report, as you mentioned, was on September the 4th. Sir Martin Moore-Bick's final report on Grenfell. It was, as you mentioned, it was obviously a national news story. And they made various recommendations. Some of it is, 1,700 pages, and I can't pretend I've looked through it all, but it's quite frightening. I mean, something that's not really perhaps the legal implications, it's a bit too late to do anything about it. But I mean, the first sort of fire that drew attention to some of the problems with cladding and the insulation behind it was in Huyton in Liverpool back in 1992, somewhere called Knowsley Heights. And then there was another one 7 years later, 5 years later in Scotland and Irvine. And I can remember the 2009, there was a fire in Camberwell in South London where 6 people died. That was obviously a national news story. Nothing seemed to have been done about it. There were tests being done, fire safety tests on cladding that said, how violently it sort of sets alight back in 2001. And unfortunately, it took a tragedy like Grenfell to actually do anything about it. There's, shall I tell you, sort of summarise one or two of the recommendations? I wouldn't mind sort of stressing one in particular.
Yeah, I think it'd be useful to hear about all of the major findings from this report.
Well, again, it sort of goes on. There are 58 recommendations. The government on September the 4th, Keir Starmer announced that he was going to look in detail at the recommendations and actually report back in 6 months. I think one of them relating to property law needs to change fairly urgently because there are so many flaws in the Building Safety Act. Well-meaning legislation, but not particularly well thought out, and we'll come back to that. But they talk about other things besides, like they need a single construction regulator for the construction industry, and they need a single Secretary of State for Fire. I mean, just in relation to Grenfell, there were 3 separate government bodies involved in it, in fire safety and the likes. Building regulations was down to the Department of Levelling Up, as it was. It's now changed its name with a change of government to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. The construction products and likes and product safety was down to the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which has now changed its name as well to the, if I can remember, Department of Business and Trade.
Just to keep us all on our toes with all these acronyms.
Well, they always change. Whoever's responsible for housing is always changing. But there's one old familiar favourite, and that's the Home Office, who deal with things like fire safety, the fire rescue services, and the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. So that makes a bit of sense to have one body. They're talking about things like reviewing the private sector. Use in the building regulations industry, as an alternative to local authority building control, which came about in the 1980s. But I think they probably rightly pointed out that having private sector building control causes perhaps it has been regulated under the Building Safety Act much more than in the past. But it causes conflicts of interest. People in the private sector want to make sure they don't lose their customers or they obtain customers. and don't necessarily see what they should be seeing, and also competition with local authorities. And they're talking about sort of a specific fire engineers and a regulatory body, a recognised regulatory body for fire safety professionals, which seems to make sense as well. But the other thing, which I've thought for a long, long time, is the definition of higher risk buildings.
What is the definition of high risk buildings currently then?
Well, there's actually three stages to the high risk building legislation. One is the sort of design stage. Secondly is the construction stage, and thirdly is the occupation stage. And being a property lawyer, not a construction lawyer, it's the latter which is of interest to me, if you like. Currently, it's got to have at least 2 residential units in it, and so it includes mixed-use premises. And it's got to have 18 metres or more in height, or as an alternative, 7 or more stories. In Wales, the Welsh government are going to bring it in relation to the design and construction stage, but not the occupation stage. They did announce earlier in the year, in the spring in Wales, that they are going to introduce their own Building Safety Wales bill, which will be much, much more sort of exhaustive in England. Any property will be deemed high risk if it's got 2 residential units or more. I was in Wales yesterday talking about this in North Wales, and there was consternation. Originally, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said that they didn't need to introduce things rapidly because they didn't have the same problems with high-rise buildings in Wales as in England, having never looked out of the window at the Welsh Assembly building and seen what Cardiff is like nowadays, mile upon mile. So you're going to have your own in Wales Building Safety Wales bill. In England, it causes so many problems. I know we chatted a bit about it in a podcast earlier in the year, not least of which no one's quite sure how you measure higher risk buildings. You're supposed to measure from the bottom of the ground floor to the finished floor and not the top of the top floor in terms of height. And they don't really sufficiently define what a story is. It's not categorized as a story if it's just a rooftop plant of machinery and nothing more. You remember we did a case called Wait and Kadai?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A good year ago. I think it was a case from about a year ago, just over, where it was a place in Streatham in London, Liam Court Road, where the first time they measured it, surveyors, it was 17.57 metres in height. Then they decided to measure it again. It came to 17.9 something in metres in height, but with a margin of error of 30 centimetres, which tipped them to being a higher risk building. Then they decided that to define a higher risk building, in the definition of where you measure to, it had a shared roof terrace, and they should be measuring to the shared roof terrace, which tipped it well over. And remember, we talked about how you measure stories and things. We came across one which was it was in terms of leaseholder protections, where it's 5 stories or 11 meters in height, service charge caps, where it was a 4-story block of flats with a ridged roof, which was used for boarded out for storage, and that's probably a 5-story block. So they do really need to change make clear the definitions. But the Moore-Bick report, I think quite rightly, made clear that the 18 meters, 7 stories seems completely arbitrary. They just seem to have selected that as being higher risk and run with it. And as a matter of urgency, I think we all need to some clarification on it, and also in terms of the leaseholder protections as well as lawyers. But as a matter of urgency, they are urging the government to look at the definition, because it doesn't deal with things like vulnerable people in the premises, presumably care homes, this kind of stuff, who are going to find it difficult to exit in the event of emergencies, not just fire safety, but structural issues and the likes. We've done a few podcasts over the years in relation to structural safety, including the Tower Hamlets one that we've just reached. Tower Hamlets and Brewster House and Maltings House. So we'll have to see what happens. But I wish to goodness they would just. I mean, they don't, even in terms of high risk film, there's different definitions of how to measure the height and the building safety out from building regulations. It just seems to be done piecemeal. So a Secretary of State for Fire Safety is no bad thing.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Richard.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lizzie.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to everybody for listening. We'll see you again in our next episode.